I'm the president and CEO of the Japanese American National Museum. I guess it started for me when I was in high school, and I began to see what some of the disparities were in the country. South Africa was a deeply, deeply divided country. It was governed by the apartheid system, which meant that people of races were kept entirely separate. In my first year at university, that I got involved in student activism and student protests. And I remember volunteering for long shifts in the emergency room. And we were hearing on state-controlled media that these were children that had provoked the police and that they were throwing stones at police. And of course, what we were seeing in the emergency room was completely different from, and the reality was completely different from what we were hearing. So that for me was a major turning point. And I got more involved in the resistance. I was in the leadership of a national organization called the Black Sash. It was a women's organization. And the more I took on leadership positions, the more under scrutiny I was. So we were talking to people who were in, people who'd been tortured, people that had been released from jail, people that had been forcibly removed, families that had lost, their loved ones, their children, their fathers, their mothers to disappearances. There was a complete clampdown on information. So we were actually taking information and smuggling it out to diplomatic bags, and Amnesty International was our primary recipient of the information, so it was threatening. So it became apparent that the state wanted to have a treason trial, a show trial. So that was how I got to being in jail. I was adopted as a prisoner of conscience, and they worked on my case, and there was this international campaign for my release. The camps were an egregious expression of racism and bigotry in its very worst form. I think it's an incredible blot on US history. It was a great tragedy. I think because of my own background, I just felt very deeply without having experienced it, I think that I had some understanding of what the enormity of the tragedy was and the enormity of the consequences for Japanese Americans. Going to the first DOR, Day of Remembrance here, which was in, the 75th anniversary, the first one in 2017, which was really for me just one of the most moving experiences that I think I have ever had. For me, it was seeing those banners coming in. And I actually still get quite emotional when I see that. And sort of thinking and just understanding what they represented, and just understanding how the enormous, apart from, the enormous toll that had taken on the community, just the extraordinary sort of commitment to ensuring that it never happened again. And that is what, for me, that was what the banners represented. My first experience was at the Manzanar pilgrimage in 2017. I didn't expect to be as deeply moved as I was. I didn't expect to feel the rawness of emotion, and I didn't expect to be taken back to my own history in the way that I was. And I know that from my own history, my time in jail, I know that there are all sorts of things that I've never resolved. I know that there's all sorts of PTSD things I've never resolved. And I think for me, one of the things about being at JANM has been able to get to be in touch. Sorry, I get a little bit emotional, but to be in touch with those things, and to be able to acknowledge those things. And I think the pilgrimages have, each one sort of successively has unlocked that. It was just understanding, how deeply sort of central the camp experience has been, how it's so part of the DNA. The Tule Lake experience was, for me personally, enormously profound, and I think in some ways quite cathartic. In the struggle days in South Africa when people were killed, the political gatherings were banned. And the only time you could really gather was at the funerals. And I felt it so strongly at Tule Lake as we were sitting there listening to the dedication ceremony in front of the stockade, because you had, there was the smell of the dust, which you had in South Africa, because these funerals would literally be out in the veld, or in a school soccer stadium, with gravel. And then there would always be these portable PA systems, which would pick up every single whisper of wind. So there would be the smell of this dust, there'd be the smell of the dust rising, and then this constant whispering of the wind in the PA system, and the crackling and the croaking of the PA system. And sitting at Tule Lake took me back in a way that nothing else has taken me back to that time. So for me, it was profound in unlocking something that was so deep. And, in sort of going back in that journey, I think that there are many things that I'm seeing differently because of that experience. I don't quite know what they are, because it's going to take me several years to unpack, but it was so deeply emotional. Suddenly, the issues of social justice and civil rights and so many of those things that had almost felt settled to some extent in this country were coming to the fore again. The climate of hatred and prejudice that made the incarceration of Japanese Americans so much easier and so much more palatable.
It's a climate in which the language of prejudice is again becoming policy, in which truth is perverted, and racial hatred even makes racial violence permissible. We've seen Charlottesville. We've seen the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists marching. We're seeing the criminalization of immigration. We're seeing over 700 children have been separated from their mothers that are seeking to come into this country as migrants or refugees. This country has closed its doors. It's closed its borders to refugees, people who are seeking asylum.
It's that thing, I think, of walking the talk. There's an enormous amount of work that has to be done. An enormous amount of work that has to be done.